the federal death penalty in the United States, one of the harshest and most final forms of justice. It has long been a topic of fierce debate, shrouded in controversy and moral conflict. While it is legal across all 50 states and territories, its application remains rare. Yet history has shown that this can change with the stroke of a pen. In a stunning decision on December 23, 2024, President Biden commuted the sentences of 37 federal death row inmates, leaving only 3 prisoners facing execution. But this was not always the norm. Under the Trump administration, after nearly 2 decades without federal executions, capital punishment was revived. In his first term alone, 13 convicted criminals were put to death, making him the president with the most executions in over a century. Now, with his return to office, the question looms: will history repeat itself? In this chilling episode, we delve into the lives of those who faced the ultimate punishment, their crimes, their final moments, their last meals, and their haunting last words. Wesley Ira Perkey, Indiana, executed July 16, 2020. January 26, 1998, marked the beginning of a chilling chapter in Kansas City, Missouri. A bright and promising teenage girl, Jennifer Long, vanished without a trace, leaving her family and community in anguish. The man behind her disappearance, Wesley Ira Perkey, a name that would soon become synonymous with brutality and tragedy, the crime that shocked a nation. Wesley Ira Perkey, a man with a troubled past, kidnapped Jennifer Long, a 17-year-old high school student, in a calculated and cold-blooded act. Jennifer's life was cut short in a horrifying manner. Perkey subjected her to a brutal attack, ending her life before dismembering her body and disposing of it in a septic pond. The gruesome nature of the crime sent shockwaves through the community, leaving investigators and the public alike desperate for answers. But Jennifer was not Perkey's only victim. As authorities dug deeper into his dark history, they uncovered another heinous act: the murder of an 80-year-old woman whom Perkey had bludgeoned to death with a hammer. The elderly woman, a beloved member of her community, had been living a quiet life before her tragic encounter with Perkey. The trial and conviction. In 2003, Wesley Ira Perkey faced justice in federal court. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury delivered a swift verdict: guilty. Perkey was sentenced to death for his crimes, a decision that brought a measure of closure to the families of his victims. However, the road to justice was far from over. For 17 years, Perkey sat on death row, his legal team tirelessly appealing his sentence. They argued that he suffered from schizophrenia and early-onset Alzheimer's, rendering him mentally unfit for execution. The appeals process dragged on, prolonging the agony for the victims' families, who yearned for closure. The final hours, on July 15th, 2020, the night before his execution, Wesley Ira Perkey made a peculiar request for his last meal: a nut cake. The unusual choice sparked curiosity and debate, with some interpreting it as a final nod to his troubled psyche. As the clock ticked down, Perkey was given one last opportunity to address the world. In his final statement, Perkey expressed remorse for his actions. "I deeply regret the pain I caused to Jennifer Long's family. I am so sorry," he said. His words, though heartfelt, could never undo the devastation he had wrought. At 8:19 a.m. on July 16th, 2020, Wesley Ira Perkey was declared dead. His execution marked the end of a decades-long saga, but the scars he left behind remain etched in the hearts of those who loved Jennifer Long and his other victim, Daniel Lewis Lee, Indiana, executed July 14th, 2020, January 11th, 1996. A quiet home in Arkansas was about to become the scene of a gruesome crime. Daniel Lewis Lee, alongside his accomplice, Chevy Kehoe, had one goal: steal cash and firearms from William Frederick Muller, a local firearms dealer. But what began as a robbery quickly turned into a nightmare. Inside the house were Muller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah. Lee and Kehoe subdued the family, bound them with duct tape, and placed plastic bags over their heads. Moments later, their lifeless bodies were tossed into a swamp in northeastern Arkansas, where they would remain undiscovered for months. Lee was arrested in June 1997, and in 1999, he was sentenced to death in federal court. His legal team argued that Kehoe, allegedly the mastermind, had received only a life sentence, but the court remained firm. Lee would face execution. For over 2 decades, he sat on death row, appealing his fate. Then, on July 14th, 2020, the moment arrived. He was offered a final meal, but he declined, opting instead for the standard prison menu. When asked for his last words, he maintained his innocence. "I didn't do it. I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but I'm not a killer. You're killing an innocent man." As the lethal injection took effect, he closed his eyes, falling silent. At 8:07 a.m., Daniel Lewis Lee was pronounced dead. Dustin Honkin, Mason City, Iowa, executed July 17th, 2020, July 25th, 1993. The quiet town of Mason City, Iowa, became the backdrop for one of the most chilling crime sprees in American history. At the center of it all was Dustin Honkin, a ruthless methamphetamine dealer who would stop at nothing to protect his empire, even if it meant extinguishing innocent lives. Dustin Honkin was no ordinary drug dealer. By the early 1990s, he had built a sprawling methamphetamine operation, amassing wealth and power through fear and violence. But his empire began to crumble when federal investigators started closing in. Desperation set in, and Honkin's paranoia reached a boiling point. The tipping point came when one of his closest associates, Greg Nicholson, decided to cooperate with law enforcement. Nicholson's betrayal was a direct threat to Honkin's operation, and in the twisted world of drug cartels, there was only one way to deal with a snitch: silence them permanently. Honkin, along with his girlfriend, Angela Johnson, orchestrated a plan to eliminate Nicholson. But what followed was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. On that fateful day in July 1993, Honkin and Johnson kidnapped Greg Nicholson and his girlfriend, Lori Duncan. Lori was an innocent bystander, a mother of 2 young girls who had no connection to Honkin's criminal activities. Yet she and Nicholson were brutally murdered, their lives snuffed out in cold blood. But the violence didn't end there. Honkin's thirst for vengeance extended to Lori's 2 daughters, 10-year-old Condi and 6-year-old Amber. The innocent children were executed alongside their mother, their young lives cut short in a senseless act of cruelty. 5 lives were wiped out in a single, horrifying act, all to protect Honkin's crumbling drug empire. The murders sent shockwaves through the community, and law enforcement launched a massive manhunt to bring Honkin and Johnson to justice. It took years, but in 2004, Honkin was finally convicted in federal court for the murders. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury delivered a unanimous verdict: guilty. Honkin was sentenced to death, while Angela Johnson received a life sentence for her role in the killings. The trial brought some measure of closure to the victims' families, but the scars of that tragic day would never fully heal. The final chapter, on July 17th, 2020, Dustin Honkin faced his ultimate reckoning. As he entered the execution chamber, there was no display of remorse, no heartfelt apology for the lives he had destroyed. When given the opportunity to deliver his last words, Honkin remained silent. After the murders, the pair stole Alice Slim's vehicle and used it to commit an armed robbery at a post office. Their crime spree continued until authorities launched an extensive manhunt, leading to their arrests on November 4th and 5th, 2001. A federal grand jury indicted Lesmond Charles Mitchell on 11 charges, including kidnapping, vehicle theft, and murder. Because the crime was committed during a carjacking, it fell under federal jurisdiction, ensuring that Mitchell would face the full weight of the law. During his trial in April 2003, Mitchell's defense attempted to shift blame, arguing that while he was present, he wasn't the primary perpetrator. The jury, however, saw through the lies. On May 8, 2003, Mitchell was convicted, and by September 15th, 2003, he was sentenced to death. For 17 years, Lesmond Charles Mitchell sat on death row, his case winding through the appeals process. Meanwhile, the families of Alice Slim and Tiffany Lee waited for justice, their grief compounded by the prolonged legal battle. The final chapter, finally, on August 26, 2020, the day of reckoning arrived. Mitchell was executed by lethal injection at United States Penitentiary, Terre Haute. Family members of the victims and representatives of the Navajo Nation, who had opposed his execution, watched from the witness room. When asked for his last words, Mitchell simply replied, "No, I'm fine." At 6:29 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Keith Dwayne Nelson, Grain Valley, Missouri, executed August 28th, 2020. In the quiet town of Grain Valley, Missouri, a horrifying crime unfolded in 1999 that would leave a community in shock and a family shattered. At the center of this tragedy was Keith Dwayne Nelson, a man whose actions would forever stain the pages of criminal history. On a seemingly ordinary day, 10-year-old Pamela Butler was playing outside her home in Kansas City, Kansas. Unbeknownst to her, Keith Dwayne Nelson was lurking nearby, driving a white van that would soon become the vehicle of her abduction. Nelson, a predator with a history of violence, snatched Pamela from her neighborhood, leaving her family and community in a state of panic. Nelson drove Pamela to a remote forest in Grain Valley, Missouri. There, in the seclusion of the woods, he subjected the young girl to unspeakable abuse before strangling her with a wire. Her lifeless body was abandoned in a wooded area near the Grain Valley Christian Church, a place that should have symbolized peace and safety. The white van Nelson used in the abduction did not go unnoticed. A janitor from the Grain Valley Christian Church, along with his wife, spotted the suspicious vehicle parked near the church. After seeing news reports about Pamela's kidnapping, they immediately contacted the police. 2 days after the crime, the van was found abandoned in Kansas City, Missouri. The investigation intensified, and a civilian employee of the police department made a crucial breakthrough. Nelson was discovered hiding under a bridge, attempting to evade capture. When confronted, he tried to escape by swimming across a river, but was quickly surrounded by railroad workers who held him until the police arrived. When questioned about Pamela's whereabouts, Nelson coldly replied, "I know, but I won't tell you." His callousness only deepened the anguish of Pamela's family and the investigators working tirelessly to bring her home. The next day, police officers combed the wooded area behind the Grain Valley Christian Church and made the grim discovery of Pamela's body. The community's worst fears were confirmed, and the search for justice began. The trial and sentencing. On October 21st, 1999, Keith Dwayne Nelson was federally charged with kidnapping resulting in death. Because he had crossed state lines with Pamela, his case fell under the jurisdiction of the Federal Kidnapping Act. In November 2001, Nelson pleaded guilty to the charges. During the sentencing phase, his defense team argued that his traumatic childhood and psychological issues should be considered mitigating factors. However, the prosecution emphasized the sheer brutality of the crime and Nelson's complete lack of remorse. The jury was unmoved by the defense's arguments and sentenced Nelson to death. For nearly 2 decades, he sat on death row as his legal team filed appeals, delaying the execution. The execution on August 28th, 2020. Keith Dwayne Nelson faced his final judgment. At the Terre Haute Penitentiary in Indiana, he was executed by lethal injection. When given the opportunity to deliver his last words, Nelson offered a single, chilling response. No. At 4:32 p.m., he was declared dead. His execution brought a measure of closure to Pamela's family, but the pain of their loss remains eternal.